Hi, Next Economy Now listeners. In celebration of our second cohort of Next Economy Living beginning this October, we're launching a special mini-series on the podcast to explore ways to build our individual and collective resilience strategies during these critical times. If you enjoy this episode and are excited about designing your life in alignment with your values in a supportive community environment, consider joining our fall cohort of Next Economy Living. In this 6-month learning journey, we'll learn how to deepen our security and resilience practices to thrive and flourish amidst ecological and economic challenges. Learn more and sign up for a free coffee chat with one of our facilitators at bit.ly/Next Economy Living.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I'm Kevin Bayuk, a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Julia Watson. Julia is a designer, activist, and academic recognized as a leading expert in Lo-TEK. That's Lo-TEK, as in Traditional Ecological Knowledge, nature-based technologies for climate resilience. She is also the author of a very important book, and a book that I actually purchased, which is just a gorgeous book called Lo-TEK, Design by Radical Indigenism. And she has an upcoming sequel that's titled Lo-TEK Water. Julia's work foregrounds intercultural knowledge in the design of systems, spaces, and innovations. Through her analysis of low-tech approaches, she explores how cultures develop sustainable solutions rooted in traditional knowledge, advocating for traditional knowledge and local innovations that address food security, water management, sustainable shelters, thriving habitats, all aspects of what Lift Economy would call the economy for how people meet their needs. Julia also emphasizes kind of hybridizing local technologies with otherwise known as high tech while protecting Indigenous intellectual property and contribution. Julia regularly teaches urban design at Harvard and Columbia University and co-founded the Lo-TEK Institute as an agent for nature-based education and advocacy, working to empower Indigenous communities and guide non-Indigenous ones in respectful knowledge application. I'm particularly excited to speak with Julia because her integrative, innovative work and analysis directly aligns with the Next Economy Now podcast focus. Leaders who are taking regenerative, equitable, and whole systems approaches to creating a next economy that works for the benefit of all life. Her insights into ancient and contemporary wisdom and nature-based technologies offer crucial pathways for climate resiliency and alternative economic models. Julia, welcome to Next Economy Now.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much. Just before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the traditional lands of the Lo-TEK people, the First People of Springs, New York, and I want to honor both their land and their people. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Definitely our pleasure. Thanks, Julia. I'm wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit about your background or your story that has brought you to this amazing body of work and contribution.
Yeah, sure. So I am an Australian American. So I began my days on the planet over in Australia, a long way away, and was living in a really small town, city in Australia that was pretty conservative, as Australia still is, I would say. But I actually grew up in a really incredible inner city part of that particular town where we had a huge diversity of different communities, both international communities, very diverse LGBTQ community, and a really thriving Indigenous community. And that Indigenous community and the actual place was called Kurilpa, which means place of the water rat. And where I grew up, that particular neighborhood was a really important place for millennia, for meeting grounds next to what is called the Brisbane River for the Turrbal people and some other communities. And so all through my childhood, I'm Greek Egyptian descent, so I grew up in a really Greek neighborhood, but there was a lot of different community members. But within that mixture, there was always First Nation presence that was very, very strong. I started studying architecture out of high school, even though I didn't become an architect. But I went to this incredible university. And in the second year of architecture school at that university, every single student took a course called Aboriginal Environments. And that was just a prerequisite course. That was part of our basic architectural education. And when I took that course, I talk about it as experiencing something like an unlearning from my historical perspective, my understanding of landscapes, my understanding of place and the region which I inhabited. Everything started to shift. As I said, Brisbane at that time in the 80s and 90s was conservative, but I had a pretty incredible education up until that time where First Nations poets and writers, and not so much histories, I would say, but there was a large presence of knowledge that was part of education system. However, understanding place and landscape and country through that particular course that I did in architecture school really was a significant shift. And that's where I sort of began a bit of a redirection, a new trajectory. And I decided architecture wasn't the pathway I would travel. I wanted to keep on exploring this understanding that I lived in a country that had been inhabited for millennia by a First Nations community that wasn't at the forefront of the dominant culture in that country. Yet, in understanding place and country and ecosystem, it was of the preeminent importance, I felt, as a designer, as an architect, as a landscape architect. So I went on a pathway of studying landscape architecture, really trying to explore those aspects of the discipline. What does indigeneity mean in the landscape? What does sacredness in the landscape mean? How do we make both of those narratives present, equal, and what does that do to shape users and participants within that ecosystem and within those knowledge systems? And so I think I had a really incredibly unique, perhaps not for Australia, but perhaps globally, education and understanding. And that progressed throughout my career. I ended up doing what most Australians do, went to London. I worked for a lord from the colonies, went to the imperial capital and experienced that, came back to Australia after a few years and was a landscape architect in practice when I applied to go to Harvard. And my thesis to explore at Harvard was to understand what sacredness was in the landscape and to understand why sacred landscapes, and particularly sacred natural landscapes, became such contested territories. And that contestation could be around mineral rights, it could be around land transformation, deforestation, or it could be around Western systems of governance or conservation really having a lot of different frictions with Indigenous forms of sacredness and essentially conservation. Most of the conservation that has happened 1900s, late 1800s, really saw Indigenous communities displaced from their traditional lands. So it's not the conservation story is not a story that is we can sort of disassociate from the atrocities of ethnocide and the stolen lands. So I was really interested in exploring that relationship. I went to Harvard, had an incredible experience. But what I found was that the American education system in the school that I went to was deemed the best landscape architecture school in the country and subjectively the world. But in that particular education system and across the Americas, even though the history of First Nations communities in Australia and America are somewhat parallel, there was no institutionalization of Indigenous knowledge systems in the US. And still to this day, it's a very, very slow evolution and what some might call renaissance that is occurring. And having graduated, I began teaching pretty much immediately. And so I was teaching courses, and I guess I was doing a lot of traveling. I was doing work in Indigenous sacred landscapes, but the courses I was teaching, which were design, which were technology, all of them were really drawing on those tropes of US Eurocentric worldviews. And while I was teaching, I was using most of the sourcing that was the, I would say, sort of typical, but most cutting edge and innovative sourcing to guide how I shaped those courses and those theses and design studios. But what I began to do was to sort of infuse some traditional knowledge systems thinking and examples into coursework, into seminar, into studio work, while I was also working on biocultural conservation and tourism management plans for the first UNESCO World Heritage Site in Bali that was protecting the cultural landscapes of Bali that had just been ratified, which was 16,500 hectares of traditional sacred rice terraces. And so as I began to, I kind of think I was doing it a little bit on the sly. I felt I was being quite subliminal about how I was infusing different worldviews and systems into the education or the courses that I was teaching. But my students would react, not only my students would react with just incredible interest, but I would sit in design school. We have these sort of, a student will present a project and we'll have all these critiques. So you'd have different professors sitting around speaking to their projects and offering examinations and comments. And I would generally sort of be there offering comments that were a little different to a lot of the other professors. I'd speak about these technologies and knowledge systems from across the globe. And often I'd get a couple of professors look around into me and say, how do you know about this? Where are you getting this information? Because a lot of what I speak about, and the reason I wrote Lo-TEK is because I couldn't find this body of research and this body of work that I really thought was so critical to how we were starting to envision climate innovation and really think about mitigation and adaptation strategies and for climate technologies really wasn't anywhere that I could find. I couldn't find the sourcing in one particular place. And so I was teaching a particular course, landscape ecotechnology. Most of my students came from non-American, non-US Eurocentric backgrounds, but from across the globe. And I decided to give them a project, which was go back to your country. And consider this, all of these students had come to this schools for the same reason I came, because it's told that it's the best school, the best type of education, leading, cutting edge, but with a very particular ideology of US Eurocentrism. And so I said, go back to your countries. I would like, not physically, but in your research, to go back to your countries, explore technology, climate technology or landscape technology in your own countries. And next week, come and show me a drawing of that. Every single student, and most of them were architecture or urban design students, every single student would come back with a house. I'd say, we are not looking at vernacular housing, we are looking at technology. And they would just be so confused. And then I'd show a couple of examples, which I'll go into now to give everybody an understanding of what I'm talking about. I'd show them an example of like these living root bridges that are grown in northeastern India in one of the wettest places on earth. They're grown by the Khasi people, and they grow these living root bridges so that they can traverse their landscapes, which flood incredibly during the monsoon season. And they're the only bridges that can actually withstand the incredible forces of the monsoonal rains that just travel through these landscapes, through this really hilly landscape, and cut off all the villages. So they evolved this 1,500-year-old tradition of growing bridges. And I'd show these to the students and they'd just be kind of first shocked, really intrigued. And then they'd go away and the next week they'd come back and they all had projects and or technologies from Indigenous and traditional communities from the countries that they'd come from. And they'd say to me, we didn't even know these existed. Like, we're architects. I was teaching graduate school, some of the best graduate students from their countries. We didn't know these communities made technologies. We didn't think of these things as technologies. We don't think of this as technology. Like, this is very different for you to tell us this is technology. And it's kind of the same set of commentary that I still get today. And that's why I wrote the book.
Amazing. There's so much there. And thank you for sharing. Thank you for that journey and for your sensitivity and awareness of the observations you were making about what was interesting to the students, interesting to yourself, and then the lack of a place to explore this information in kind of one place. And it's an incredible contribution, this
Thank
book,
you.
and I imagine your sequel as well. Another thing that I heard you say that I think is really important, and I might just underscore it for Next Economy Now listeners, is this kind of conservation as almost a extension of colonial imposition. I sometimes call it, like, not my grandfather as in like my actual grandfather, but I call it my grandfather's conservation of, like,
Yeah.
take land, cut it off from indigenous process and life ways, and separate it as a model of some kind of conservation.
Yeah.
And there's no process, no interaction, and yet contrasting that with what you're talking about, this kind of conservation through process and engagement of a people connected to place, literally rooted in place, such that it confers resilience, climate adaptive capacities, all the things that are really critical and important today. And
Yeah.
building off that, maybe I'd love to hear if somebody said, so Julie, I have a lot of reasons why I might say this, but like somebody might ask, why is this important? It seems like it's important morally of what's been marginalized in society, but there's a lot of reasons why this is important. And I'd be curious if somebody said to you, tell me, Julia, Lo-TEK, why is it important today?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your
Yeah.
take.
Well, I think riffing off what you just said about conservation, I'm going to say two things. So, what's deeply important, and I think what will really resonate as well with the foundation of what you're exploring with this podcast, is that there's value systems in the reason why Indigenous communities protect land, create technologies which are incredibly symbiotic with ecosystems. And there was a value system that was different to that as to why the conservation movement was born. And so you can explore the sort of foundations of those value systems. And one of them was recreation, having space for people to amble through wild landscapes and to have, there's many other reasons, but a significant reason why sort of the Sierra Club and John Muir and the foundations of the conservation movement, and why it was a reason why there are millions of conservation refugees now, and why Yosemite National Park, which was one of the first national parks established in the USA, had the Awanichi tribe there, and that nation was eradicated. The last Awanichi person, they set up a pretend village and had Awanichi people pretending to be living in a native circumstances, and then the last Awanichi person who lived in Yosemite Park, a fire response exercises, they set his house on fire and then pretended to put it out. And so he was just removed. The whole community was removed. Yosemite National Park, which was designed by Olmsted, a grandfather of the landscape architecture movement, they came to Yosemite and were like, this is such an incredible place. Yes, it was an Indigenous sacred landscape. It had been actively managed by community for thousands of years. It looked like a parkland because there was specific spacing of trees and cultural burning practices. It was a highly managed landscape. That's why it was so beautiful. And it was a very sacred landscape. So it's interesting that my history of sacred landscapes was the exploration that got me into this sort of line of work. But sort of this exploration of sacred landscapes, you pass that on intergenerationally. So you suddenly become a natural sacred landscape and conservation parkland for present day culture as well, but with the eradication of Indigenous community who had fostered and looked after that landscape. Now, today, 80% of the world's global biodiversity is found within Indigenous lands. That's a really important parallel because land management or landscape technology or Lo-TEK, which I call it, is the reason why Yosemite National Park was first fostered as a conservation landscape, why it was so well managed, why it's so biodiverse, the technology. So biodiverse regions, which, secure our global biodiversity, which is incredibly important for the health and vitality of the entire planet, for our food systems, our water systems, our air, all our really large scale ecological processes. Biodiversity is inherently the most important value of that. Indigenous technology underpins all of that biodiversity. So what I say is that we are in the midst of the Earth's sixth mass extinction, a mass extinction with a speed that we have never, ever documented before on the Earth. And it's anthropocentric driven mass extinction. But 80% of the biodiversity still left exists on Indigenous lands. I think that while we call the 21st century the century where we will experience and lose the greatest biodiversity on the planet, that is granted. I think the untold story or the realization at the end of this century is that we have actually lost some of the most important climate technology that exists on this planet, that has existed for millennia, that has upheld all of the planet's working, vital, healthy ecosystems and its biodiversity as part of that sort of hand that's holding it. Because we just were too US Eurocentric focused. We were too colonial. We were too obsessed with a future that was high tech. We didn't look outside of these systems of classification that were adopted 500 years ago that said we are separate from nature, that technology is something that is non-natural, non-biologically sort of ecosystem powered, that we were just too blinded by this idea of primitivism that's associated with traditional ecological knowledge and customs and the past that has, protected the oldest thing that we have is the planet and all its resources. So we just let it go. And I really believe, and I see it happening, that technology is the most efficient, the most low cost, the most intelligent, adaptive technologies. And if we're really going to scale climate resilience at a global level, finding technologies that already exist in community, that have community ownership, that have governance systems that control them, that work the best with those landscapes, work with social and kinship systems. That's the type of technology that we want to scale and expand. You don't want to come in with a universal technology from the West and say, oh, no, you're all doing it wrong. We know, because we're progressive. And that's what's been happening. And that's really why I wrote the book, because I was involved in international studios from some of the best universities that were teaching that type of ideology, this like neo-colonial understanding of like, what is the best, how should we work to bolster the climate crises and the sort of extreme conditions that we're starting to experience, and really coming in and saying, whatever's been happening here till now, it either won't work at scale, it's not sophisticated in terms of equity or, that function of being able sort of being an equitable project. And we should just do something different. And in that equation, what usually happens, especially for sort of a global South community, is when you have someone coming into that particular community and saying, look, this is the best way to shore up your water systems or your food systems or protect yourself against, climate impact of intensifying weather events or flood. You should do it like this. But to do that, you're probably going to have to get a foreign direct investment loan from us. And we'll keep you in this cycle of debt once we've constructed all these multi-million billion dollar projects. And they'll probably only last for 50 to 75 years. And then we'll have to do something again. So what I actually propose in Lo-TEK is to work with the DNA of people, place, millennia-old knowledge, and the sort of existing social cultural fabric to come up with adaptive mitigating climate solutions that also increase, sort of protect against food scarcity, water scarcity, create jobs, just really scale all of the services in an informal way, but in a way that is incredibly sophisticated and intelligent and adaptive, and actually has this possibility of exponential growth in place. So what you're not doing is setting up a system that always has to be managed by a community. These types of ecological systems, yes, you set them up in the beginning, then it's labor intensive and you have to manage it and maintain it and effort, but you're working with nature as your architect and culture as your engineer. So over time, those systems in place begin to take up the work. And so they actually become exponentially generative, just like an ecosystem does, to keep on building on itself and building on its health and its vitality. And just to bring it back, where I began, the value and the intention of these traditional systems and traditional technologies is not to extract, is not to make money, is not to make profit. The intention of these systems is to provide for the next 7 generations. So in place, the intention is this will be long lasting, this will be exponentially generative, this will be responding to systems that exist in place that have the possibility for multi-generational services. So you're starting with this really different set of values and intentions to create a technology that will benefit your children's 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 children.
And ostensibly, that's what we all want: survival, thriving, prosperity, reliable prosperity for all our children, grandchildren, and all generations to come. And here are these lifeways, technologies, adaptive capacities all over the world. You document them. I'm wondering if you could provide some examples. I'm sure I won't say the word like favorite, because I'm sure there's no favorite, because they're just all so amazing. And in the first book, you cover a number of biomes: mountains, forests, deserts, wetlands, with just amazing examples, inspiring examples, detailed, in your analysis, just thorough and wonderful. I'm wondering if you could share some examples, especially for any listener who's like, well, I understand when you call a macro hydro dam a colonial imposition, but that I recognize that as technology. But maybe they, like you said, even some of your students wouldn't recognize certain things as technology until you exposed it as like, hey, look at what's here. I'm wondering if you could share some examples that could help animate. You've already shared some, but I'm wondering if there's a couple that you could mention.
Yeah. I'll quickly go back to the living root bridge, just because I've talked about that. And if anyone ever sees the book, you see that on the cover of the book. And these are these incredible bridges that are actually created by growing 2 trees across a river. And a grandfather, is usually a man, will come and plant these 2 trees with the intention that one day there'll be a bridge, but he won't see it in his lifetime. There is a bamboo bridge that is constructed, and then these secondary roots of these ficus elastic or rubber fig trees are braided and woven through this bamboo bridge, and they'll eventually keep growing as they're maintained and braided over time, probably by that person's son. And then once those roots are long enough, they'll be planted into the opposing sides of that river, and they keep on growing and keep on roving. It takes about 50 years before someone can begin to traverse that bridge. They've got double decker, they've got triple decker bridges. They look like, a fantastical fairy hobbit wonderland kind of creation. And I've walked over these, I've hugged them, you knock on them and you can tell it's alive. And it's really interesting to have an infrastructure that's living, because all our infrastructure is very static and very dead. And that's why they become brittle. That's why our bridges fall down. That's why they get swept away. But these bridges, they last for like 500 years, these bridges. But that's one example. And it's a beautiful example because, as I said, the man that would plant those trees, it's probably his grandchildren that will actually get to use that infrastructure. And not only when planting those trees, the ownership of that bridge, it doesn't belong to that man, and it doesn't belong to that man's village who he came from. It actually is a shared ownership between the two villages that bridge connects. There's also just a really incredible understanding of collaborative, cooperative ownership of a particular infrastructure to take care of that, because it's the actual connection between two communities. A second very interesting, and the reason I wrote the book in the first place, and I've mentioned this as well, is the Subak, which is the Bali cultural heritage landscape, which I worked in and designed this tourism management and biocultural conservation plan for. But the Subak system is both the name, Subak is the name of the community of farmers and also the name of this system of rice terraces. The system of rice terraces is probably like one of the oldest terrace growing communities on the planet. They have they have terraformed the whole island of Bali. And underneath this sort of terraforming of the terraces of this pretty mountainous landscape, they've honeycombed that landscape as well, because they've got these water conveyance tunnels that are tunneling water from different places all over the island to these particular big rice terrace watersheds. So they're changing a watershed with these terraces, and they control water that moves through these watersheds of Subak. The water is controlled by temples. They're called water temples. And the priest at that water temple, he's in control of when the water is released into that particular Subak, or that watershed system. They're growing rice there, and they have multiple yields per year. They grow it without fertilizer. They grow it without any pesticides. The way they do that is because the water that washes down from these beautiful mountaintops that are inhabited by the gods and goddesses of the island, they bring with them, when the monsoon rains, all these phosphorus and magnesium and nitrogen, or everything that they need to keep on fertilizing these rice terraces that they continuously use for the last 2,000 years. So these sort of rice terraces are being constantly watered and filtered, therefore not needing extra fertilizers. And then they don't need pesticides, because the water temple priests, he will say, right, we have 10 different Subak watersheds in this really large landscape area. We're going to flood the system at exactly the same time, and then we're going to drain the system at exactly the same time at such a large scale that pests can't move from location to location. So the scale at which they synchronize their flooding and draining systems across a really wide landscape of watersheds is actually the reason why they don't need any pesticides. So there's this huge hydrological symphony that's occurring across these large landscapes of the island to keep this incredibly organic and thousands-year-old system in place that is actually a religious sacred system that's in working order. One other example that I'd like to share with you is the East Calcutta wetlands. And it's a bit of a different example, because it gives you an in situ example of a system that has evolved in the last few hundred years. It's now the fourth generation fish farmers who are controlling and collaborating and have this cooperative system. It lies on the outskirts of the city of Calcutta, which is a city of 15 million people. So it's a very, very dense urban landscape. It's a system of 350 fish farms, a very large area. I think it's, off the top of my head, I think it's 50 hectares, but I'm going to have to fact check that one. Maybe we can put it in the show notes. But what they're doing is they're actually producing fish. So they're fish farming. It's an aquaculture system. But the way that they are producing their fish is the wastewater that is coming out of the city of Calcutta of 15 million people has no formal wastewater treatment system. So the rivers are full of sewage and wastewater. Off the Hooghly River, which is one of the main rivers that's coming out of the city of the core of Calcutta, they are siphoning off that water. It's going through the system of settling ponds and wastewater treatment, but natural wastewater treatment, not STP or a chemical coal-powered food wastewater treatment, going through this natural landscape. Eventually it gets to the fish pond, and whatever's at that tertiary sort of treatment of that water, that's feeding the fish. And then the water's coming out of that system after about 30 days, combined with sunshine and sewage, this sunshine and sewage, algae and bacteria and fish working to clean that water. It then moves out of this system and goes into the Bay of Bengal clean. So it's not water that's being reticulated as a drinking water or anything like that. It's water that's then moving down in its natural hydrological landscape. But rather than going into the Bay of Bengal, which is a very pristine and incredibly important bay and biodiverse, it's coming out into that bay relatively clean. So it's this huge treatment system. It's not just treating the water. It's not just growing fish. They're actually also growing a lot of rice and vegetables that's irrigated by the water in this system that's coming out clean. That means you don't have to transport all that food very far from the city, because it's running the outskirts of the city back into the city for food, which cuts down fuel costs, it cuts down transportation. It also reduces the need for irrigation because you're irrigating right there on the spot. It provides 80,000 jobs to residents of that area of the city. It saves the city approximately, it's estimated, about $21 million in running a wastewater treatment system, a formal wastewater treatment system that's coal-powered, chemically using wastewater treatment system. It has incredible carbon sequestration value. It's a recreation landscape. It is super biodiverse. It is in all ways sort of exemplary of what a climate mitigating, flood protecting, food producing, job producing, water cleansing technology for a sophisticated future city should be. Problem is it's informal. Problem is it's not very valued by the government, by the regional government. Problem is it's getting filled in because for real estate development, because you can tax land for real estate, but you can't tax this land of this system or this aquatic system. Its value is that it offers everything for free. And that's part of the problem, is that we don't value these free services that nature provides us. Therefore, we don't value these incredible climate technologies that we have existing in place in cities. And we just think of them either as conservation areas. We don't really seem to value the actual technological infrastructure that they are. And this is incredibly unique. I found a couple more of these types of examples in China, in Indonesia, and the same narrative cycles around these types of systems. Incredibly sophisticated, complex nature-based solutions and technologies that protect cities from devastating floods and provide them food and clean their water through these beautiful circular systems, but they're incredibly undervalued.
And thank you for bringing them to light so that we can, as global peoples, recognize, have it reflected back to us how critical these biocultures. And I'm impressed by when you're referring to as technologies, it's not just infrastructure. There's also a process component to it, and it's yielding all these enormous outcomes: food security, clean water, beauty, vocational opportunities, waste management, treatment, conveyance, or transportation opportunities, connecting and the governance. That there's probably components of collaboration and maybe even peace that could result as outcomes. So there's biocultural artifacts that result from this, both the infrastructure and the process. They're alive, enhancing biodiversity, all those plurality of polycultural outcomes that you're describing from these types of technologies. And of course, they're mitigating and reducing all the harms. They're not creating health problems from pesticides or herbicides and carcinogenic compounds. They're not creating more greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, they're actually sequestering. And so
they're also bio-uptakers, a lot of them. So they're actually bio-uptaking all of the chemical pollutants that we have produced and put in place in our ecosystems They're actually cleaning them for us.
Remarkable. And we have struggled in from at least the colonial white supremacist kind of world to recognize these in terms of their value and the sacred, worth sacrificing for, the sacred nature of these places. And they're all over the world, and you've documented them in this book and a book that's coming out focused on water. I'm wondering one thing that I can imagine a listener saying, okay, I'm starting to appreciate these, or I'm increasing my appreciation of these artifacts and processes and cultures as technologically sophisticated. But what about, is there an intersection? Because you do talk about hybridization. So
Yeah.
so we can level with water, but now there's lasers, and we can level with lasers. Can you speak a little bit about the hybridization of, is
Yeah.
there a place for quote unquote high tech integrative sense?
Yeah. I want to just quickly touch on what you mentioned just before as well, and then I'll go to the hybridization. The Subac system is considered one of the most democratic systems on the planet. So when the Subac farmers all meet, there's obviously a hierarchy of priests and farmers and community leaders and individual farmers. In a Subac meeting, everybody sits down. Everybody is relegated to the same democratic level. There is zero hierarchy. No one can pull rank. It is just incredibly socially frowned upon to ever bring any type of social hierarchy into a Subac meeting. These are highly, highly democratic, highly collaborative. And across the board, you find these unique collaborative kinship relationships within these communities. They're diverse in like, and I'm not sort of broad brush stroking at all, obviously, but there's mechanisms that create these incredibly vital and democratic social relationships within these communities. That means that they can operate in perpetuity. And the other thing is, you talk about practice and that it's not just infrastructure, it's process. So traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, which is sort of the riff of Lo-TEK, which means local TEK, that's where I made up the word, is defined as a cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. And that's what it's sort of going back to that first sort of commentary I had about conservation, and it's the belief systems, it's the values and intentions, it's the understandings, and this worldview that humans are part of nature, humans are vital to nature. That is the foundation of all these types of technologies. It's a really different understanding and a worldview and a belief system than dominant US Eurocentric extractivist cultural understanding of our place on this planet. But the hybridization question is really, I think, where I came to this work. And along the way in the research, it's sort of, I postulated that based on the work of Fikret Berks, he was a philosopher theorist who spoke a lot about traditional ecological knowledge and the migration potential of these technologies, which is happening already. Cultural burning, which globally has been outlawed in many places across the planet, which is really essential to the vitality of certain types of pyrotechnological ecosystems, California being one of those. And that was preeminently came to the forefront during the Palisades fires, that these types of landscapes actually need fire management and cultural burning. In Australia, it was outlawed. It's actually coming back. I know that they're now using cultural burning in California, but we see this type of technology all over the world. But in some locations, that knowledge sometimes takes 1 or 2 generations to be completely lost. And so now that we see the experience of really savage wildfires across the globe, communities in Portugal, communities in other locations around the world where there's not that living practice of cultural burning, that's where you see the migration of technology. So that's kind of like one example of hybridization, I guess, where you can teach an ancient technology to deal with new climate extremes that are being experienced that are threatening communities. The other one is this idea of, and I want to state that my stance is not the future is not high tech, the future is low tech, and I have sort of one is, vilified and one is not. That's very sort of reductive and dualistic thinking that I don't think helps anybody. I think that extractive technologies, that linear extractive technologies will die. And we're starting to see that with the death of fossil fuels. And that regenerative, circular, or cyclical, I call them in the new book, technologies like renewable energies, they will keep going because they understand how time works. They understand that time is cyclical, that nature is cyclical. And if we start to merge our technologies to really work with those truths, those planetary truths, then we have something that actually will have longevity, have multi-generational ability, and not die. And so I also talk about in the next book, this idea of hybridization was really prevalent because so many people said, these are great case studies, but how do they apply? How do they work with cities? How will they be relevant where I live? And I like the first book where I was like, well, I can't find the book that I want to teach from. I'll just write it. Everyone kept on coming to me and saying, well, I was working with Vitra Design Museum in Switzerland, and they said, we're doing this exhibition. We want to show projects where traditional communities or traditional technologies are being fused with contemporary designers and artists and architects or technologies. Can you give us that list? And I said, well, I don't have that list. That's interesting that you think I would have that list. It's also interesting you think I would just give it to you. But I said, okay. And enough people asked me, and I said, well, I know a couple of projects, but how about maybe that I need to do like a deep dive into trying to understand what's that situation, what's the contemporary situation with this hybridization question that I postulate and I propose that I think is the future. And so what was really interesting in that survey was that I found out that the idea of hybridization and low-tech, it's not just a conceptual framework that might be applied in the future, that might be great if we want to protect ancestral climate technologies, is being done. We are in the midst of this already occurring. And so the first half of the next book is ancestral case studies, 22 of them from all over the globe that related to water technologies. Then I dedicated the second half of the book to contemporary projects that are infused with traditional ecological knowledge. They are material technologies, they are architectural projects, landscape architectural projects, urban revitalization projects. They are conservation projects where traditional ecological knowledge from community, either community working with scientists, community working with academics, community working with designers. In some cases, designers not working with community, but kind of modeling a little bit this extractivist ideology of I will observe, then I will apply. And I won't even talk about it, but I kind of did this deep dive survey and rewrote all of these project profiles from architects and designers and conservation. And I wrote it through the lens of TEK, and I interviewed and I said, are you using traditional ecological knowledge? And in some cases, like there's a project called Sponge City. It's a model, actually. It's not a particular project. There's, several, I think a dozen projects that use the Sponge City model in Asia. And it's he's called the contemporary Olmsted. Kong Shan-Yu is the landscape architect from China. And I interviewed him, and he's a peer of mine. He also teaches at Harvard. And I said, have you been using traditional ecological knowledge in the way that you're thinking about and designing your landscapes? He's like, yeah, of course I have. I look at how the rural farmers create these polder dike systems, which are these ponds and the landforms that surround the ponds. And I see how they use that for production. And then I also see how 6,000 years ago, there was this incredible, really large-scale system created to mitigate some of the cities against flooding. And I infuse that with mangroves for water cleansing or with food-producing landscapes, and that's how I create my sponge cities. I was like, what? Sponge City, the model, is probably the best known urban water revitalization model across the planet. You can say it kind of to someone who's not a designer. Oh yeah, I've heard of Sponge City. that is a TEK model that is being used to produce, I would say it's like heralded as one of, the most forward-thinking models in terms of urban water retention and protection. So we are here not at the beginning of whatever this, I say the sort of TEK renaissance, this technology renaissance. We are in the midst of it. We're 10 years in. There's a project that I have documented where there's a university in Peru that are working with the indigenous communities that I profile in my first book, who live on these floating island infrastructures. They're creating emergency housing technologies for communities that are affected by earthquakes in these areas out of the same type of materials, and using the weaving technologies of those communities to create new emergency housing prototypes. There's a designer in Denmark who's using an ancestral seaweed thatching technology to try and bring back seagrass thatching as a contemporary architectural material because of its incredible fire retardant qualities and insulating qualities. So we're kind of, unbeknownst to many, in the midst of this revolution, evolution, renaissance. I don't know what you want to call it. And it's paralleling at the same time that we see this like incredible AI fascination. And so we see this happening. Some people call it the epoch of AI, or we see this technological renaissance. And what's beautiful and like super sophisticated about TEK technology is that it doesn't have to be not artificial or not digital. It can be ancestral and digital. It can infuse artificial with ecological. It can be both at the same time. There's no exclusivity within it. It's just a matter of weaving those logics into a parallel relationship so that they can work together, and taking the best of that and taking the best of ancestral, and really building that emerging bioeconomy based upon this hybridization.
After all, it is a human story of the integration for our collective survival that's at stake. And so I do want to thank you for the approach in your writing and your research and your work of not being appropriative and being honoring and reverential in your treatment and discovery and writing about indigenous technology and lifeways. I think it's a very important aspect of your contribution is the sensitivity and the honoring.
And the co-authorship, always co-authoring, always working with bringing community in from the very outset so that they can shape process and placement and the sort of projective of a project. So it's always an afterthought, I think, that Indigenous and traditional communities are brought into discussion or brought to the table late, sometimes as something a little less, I think, sometimes as a bit of a symbolic, I guess, rather than
tokenization.
A bit of tokenization, yes. And I think that there's a technology that I've been working on since 2022 with a show that I had at the Barbican, which is called the SOU, the Smart Oath of Understanding. It's a blockchain technology that I was working with this group called the Enrich Hub, which is a group of Indigenous academics and intellectual property lawyers. And I was working with another friend of mine who's an intellectual property lawyer. And it came about because I was doing this project with Bureau Harper, which is a global engineering firm. And we were working with 3 different communities from around the globe to create a future technology for the year 2040 to help cities, like to mitigate urban heat island effect or help with flooding. And in the midst of this process of workshops that we're doing mid-pandemic, I sort of woke up one night and I was like, I have opened Pandora's box here, because every meeting we'd have with the engineers, they kept on saying, we've got this project that we're doing in Oxfordshire and we could definitely apply this knowledge here. And I was like, hold on, what am I doing? And I said, okay, I need to set up a system because there's nothing in place really. You can have a memorandum of understanding, which is an MOU, which is a Western legal infrastructure or a Western legal technology that's very asymmetrically aligned with Western legal systems and Western ideas of knowledge ownership and not collaborative understanding or ownership, and basically a written legal system, not an orally transmitted legal system. And so I was like, all right, what happens if we try to create some sort of a middle ground around protection of Indigenous intellectual property? And so we came up with this idea called SOU, the Smart Oath of Understanding, that use smart contracting technology that's publicly and transparently encoded into the blockchain so that anyone can see it. And smart contracts actually don't, if we were to dumb it down, we don't really need teams of lawyers to sort of fight over when, it comes to dispute or to compensate somebody for use of intellectual property. It's already there. And you can also, those payment systems through blockchain can be through crypto into a fund that is set up for a community to receive the compensation. And that compensation in the creation of that SOU, the terms and conditions of that system, they can also define their own understanding of value of their knowledge that they're sharing. And it doesn't have to be monetary value. It could be land back. It could be land stewardship. It could be anything that is to be defined by community. So that's, that's in the next book. The foreword was written by really incredible Indigenous activist and scholar, Dr. Lila June Johnston. And, one of the first calls I had with her when we were discussing whether she might want to write the foreword to this next book, I spoke to her about the SOU. And that was, I think, reason why she was like, I feel very comfortable in being able to speak with you, even though she said, in my understanding, our Indigenous ways is to gift knowledge. This knowledge is to be shared with the world. And what the world does with it, that's on the world. Like, if you're going to use this knowledge to create profit, inherently your value systems are wrong. So the technology probably won't last. But that's on you. Like, this knowledge is being given to the world to protect life for generations, and to protect the next generations to come, and give the opportunity of life the next generations to come. And so that, I just want to underscore that point about extractivism and trying to, I think, like, my role, I was brought up in an education system where the institutionalization of Indigenous knowledge was happening, and it was happening in a right way. And then I think I kind of see myself somewhat as a guide to non-Indigenous people like myself who have interest in this space, to try and teach the respectful and reciprocal ways that I have come to understand it, I have been taught, on how to act with dignity in this space in relation to these knowledge systems. And I do my best, and I try and pass that best on. And just in that idea of institutionalizing Indigenous knowledge, I, a couple of years ago, created something called Living Earth, which is a curriculum in a way to rectify this like lack of institutionalization of Indigenous knowledge in US and actually global education systems. Like, I worked with a community in Tunisia and documented one of their technologies, and I was talking to one of the co-authors, and he said, in Tunisia, it's actually outlawed to teach this in university. We can't teach this in engineering school. And that's across the board, across the globe. Hear that again and again. So the Lo-TEK Institute, which is where this curriculum operates from, which I co-founded with a veteran high school teacher, the mission is to create or to drive climate literacy that is grounded in Indigenous knowledge systems. And what we created was a 4-year course. Initially, it was for high school because I taught probably 2,000 students at university level over 12 years, and I taught 4 students from Indigenous ancestry. And so I wanted to just make high school students understand and give to the imagination of high school students the understanding that Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous technologies will form part of the future of our planet and our cities and our landscapes and our rural systems. But also this curriculum that we've established that is now being taught across the globe in high schools, it's being taught in universities, it's also being taught as professional development within global engineering firms and within Indigenous corporations around the globe. That it's really important that we are inclusive of dismissed voices and histories in how we understand climate literacy, in how we school our high school students, in how we teach our graduate students. And if we're going to really start to say, well, there's a place in the way that we design cities that can be inclusive of traditional knowledge, we need to give architects and landscape architects and engineers and developers and mayors and governments really a foundational understanding of what that actually means. And that has to be part of our sort of education system as a whole. And so, yeah, just to sort of, I wanted to recalibrate that part of this mission, as well as sort of, one of that first conversation with Dr. Lila June Johnson, she was like, we need to institutionalize Indigenous knowledge. Like that is a foundation of changing intentions, changing value systems, and changing cultural landscapes.
Indeed. Julia, I feel like I've imposed on your schedule. We're recording this in midsummer in the Northern Hemisphere, and you have a family to attend to. And maybe I'll ask one more question and we'll find a landing place. And maybe after the next book comes out, we can chat again, because I feel like I could talk to you forever. So is there anything for the Next Economy Now listeners should know about, or any ways they can help or support, or everything you're doing with the Institute and your endeavors? Is there things that we didn't talk about? I'm sure there are, but is there one thing that you'd love to highlight that we could leave the listeners with that would be helpful for them to understand?
Yeah, the book is coming out mid-September off press. It'll probably be available in North America around November. Slow burn to carry it across the seas to other lands after that, probably Australia 2026 for any Australian listeners from my home country. At the same time as the book coming out, I'm actually trying to model part of what I was speaking to and about with the SOU is bringing Indigenous practitioners and communities into process at the very beginning. For years, people have sort of been writing to me because I'm also a landscape architect and a consultant. Lo-TEK office, Lo-TEK office. What's Lo-TEK office doing? Can I work? And I always said, well, there's no Lo-TEK office. We have the Institute and we have this book series. But finally now I am launching the Lo-TEK office with this book. And I think it's a new model for a design practice. It's both scientists, life scientists, and designers working in collaboration, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous co-led studio. And we have the honor of having an advisory circle of both a majority Indigenous advisory circle guiding all our processes that has been established. And I feel it's sort of a model. We have sort of Indigenous led design studios, and we definitely have a huge plethora of non-Indigenous design studios around the world. But that hybrid from the outset, very intentionally guided by a circle of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous leaders, is something that we're trying, and also synthesizing Indigenous science with life sciences and urbanism to create something that I'm calling a new field of technological urbanism, TEK, technological urbanism. I think is really, really interesting. We also have the Living Water curriculum coming out next year, which will follow the book. I will be teaching a technological urbanism studio in the Master of Design Studies program at Harvard next year in the spring. Audiobooks coming out. There's a lot happening right now. I also, just before we leave, do want to reference a really great book that has come out in the spring by Robin Wall-Kimmerer. She's an Indigenous botanist and scientist. It's called Serviceberry. The reason I'm mentioning it is because I think it's really pertinent to this particular podcast. She's essentially trying to unpack the Indigenous sort of ideology of, I guess, gift giving and hospitality. And she talks about the gift economy, which, libraries are part of the gift economy. She talks about, neighbors baking cakes and looking after their elderly, and just this idea of being in service and what as an individual you get out of participating in the gift economy. She also talks about the whole sort of like subset of gift economy on TikTok and these different types of social media platforms, which is really interesting. I think it's just, a book by, I always I think it's good to uplift other voices in the space. And she's definitively a voice and leader in the sort of Indigenous science space. But it's a wonderful, beautiful, humble exploration of this idea of the gift economy, if anyone was interested.
Beautiful to end on a note of uplifting Indigenous voices and their important contributions to an economy that works for the benefit of all life, for reliable prosperity for all children for all time. And I feel like your work definitely is part of that contribution. And I really am grateful and honored, Julia, that you spent time today talking to us on Next Economy Now. And I look forward to being in relation with you and have more conversations into the future. And any way that we can find ways to support this really critical work, let us know.
Thank you. And
thank you
for your
really
work
appreciate it.
as well. Thank you.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you enjoyed this conversation and are looking to dive even deeper into the B Corp movement, you'll love our new podcast, Beyond the B, hosted by Lyft Economy's Amy Allison and me, Ryan Honeyman. Beyond the B is your insider's guide to the B Corp movement. You'll learn about the new B Corp standards shaping our community, how the B Corp movement is navigating the various tensions and challenges of growth, and how businesses like Patagonia are putting their commitments to people and planet in practice. Check out our latest episodes and free resources at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can also subscribe to Beyond the B on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening.
The deepest takeaway has just been this much more felt sense of possibility and clarity. We deserve this better world, and we're living it now. And when we work together, we have so much power, and there's just so much capacity for really beautiful transformation in like the home, in the workplace, in community spaces, in learning spaces. So I'm really, really glad that I chose to sign up.
You just heard from Emily, a graduate of the Next Economy MBA. If you're interested in creating an organization or vocation that aligns with a world that works for all life, we'd love to have you join our fall cohort beginning September 30th. Our 9-month program is designed to provide an accessible introduction to business and organizational fundamentals from a just and regenerative perspective, based on our work with over 300 social enterprises and 700 alumni who are transforming communities around the world. Learn more and sign up for a free intro session at lifteconomy.com/MBA. Plus, save 20% on tuition through August 11th during our early bird sale. Thanks for listening, and now onto the show.